In the quiet village of Grey Hollow, a thick forest bordered the eastern edge, where no one dared to venture. The villagers spoke of an old path that wound through the woods, a path that led to nowhere, at least, nowhere anyone ever returned from. Children were warned never to go near it, and adults refused to speak of what lay beyond. But in every generation, there was always someone curious enough to defy the warnings. That year, it was Eleanor, a young woman who had grown tired of the small, predictable life of Grey Hollow. One misty autumn evening, while the sun hung low and the air smelled of damp earth, Eleanor decided to explore the forbidden path. The entrance was barely visible, overgrown with vines and moss, as though the forest was trying to swallow it. As she stepped onto the path, an unnatural silence fell over the woods. The usual sounds of rustling leaves and chirping insects faded, replaced by the eerie stillness of something waiting. Eleanor pressed on, her curiosity battling the growing sense of dread in her chest. The deeper she ventured, the stranger the forest became. Trees twisted at odd angles, their bark blackened and slick with moisture. Shadows danced in the corners of her vision, but when she turned, nothing was there. The path seemed endless, winding through the darkness, the mist growing thicker until she could barely see a few feet ahead. After what felt like hours, Eleanor came across something that made her blood run cold, a small clearing, bathed in the dim light of the setting sun. In the center stood an ancient, crumbling house, half hidden by the creeping vines. Its windows were black voids, like eyes staring out into the wilderness, watching her. Against all her instincts, she approached. The door hung open, creaking on its rusty hinges, inviting her in. As she stepped inside, the air grew thick and suffocating. The interior was filled with dust and decay, but what struck her most was the scent, a mixture of rotting wood and something else, something foul and rancid. The house was silent, but there was a presence. Eleanor could feel it, something heavy, something wrong. She moved through the house cautiously, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. She found herself in a narrow hallway, lined with old portraits. The faces in the paintings were distorted, their features twisted in grotesque expressions of pain and fear. As she passed them, she swore their eyes followed her. At the end of the hallway was a door, slightly ajar. Beyond it, she heard a faint whisper, soft and pleading. Curiosity, once again overpowering her fear, pulled her closer. She pushed the door open and gasped. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. In the center sat an old man, hunched over, his back to her. His clothes were tattered, his skin pale and gaunt, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in decades. He was muttering something under his breath, words she couldn't understand. Excuse me," Eleanor stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The man stopped speaking, but he didn't turn around. The silence that followed was unbearable. Slowly, he stood up, his bones creaking like the old house around them. When he finally turned to face her, Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. His face, if it could even be called a face, was hollow, like a mask of rotting flesh, his eyes sunken black pits. His mouth stretched unnaturally wide into a grin that split his face in half, revealing rows of jagged, decayed teeth. The whispering started again, but this time, it came from everywhere, the walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath her feet. Eleanor backed away, her pulse pounding in her ears. She turned and ran, the whispers growing louder, a cacophony of voices urging her to stay, to never leave. The hallway seemed endless as she sprinted, the paintings on the walls now screaming, their faces contorting in agony. When she finally burst out of the house, the air outside felt no less oppressive. The path was gone, the forest around her unfamiliar and disorienting. The whispers followed her, growing louder, filling her mind with images of that twisted face, those black, empty eyes. She ran for what felt like hours, never knowing if she was getting closer to the village or deeper into the cursed woods. Finally, she collapsed, breathless and trembling, at the edge of the forest. But Grey Hollow was not as she had left it. The village was in ruins, the houses crumbling and overgrown, as though abandoned for centuries. The air was thick with an unnatural fog, and the silence was absolute. Eleanor wandered the empty streets, calling out for anyone, but there was no answer. The village had vanished into time, as though swallowed by the same curse that haunted the forest. As the sun set on the forgotten village, Eleanor realized she was alone, trapped in the past, or maybe in a place where time itself no longer mattered. The whispers returned, closer now, and with them came the shadows, dark figures slipping through the mist. She understood now why no one ever returned.